World of Warfare presents Partisans and Evaders of WW2. One of the greatest frustrations to the Third Reich throughout the war was the continued winnowing effect of resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied countries. While resistance fighters in each occupied nation pestered German troop movements with clandestine acts of sabotage, other less militant resistance fighters helped downed Allied airmen evade capture and eventually return to their air bases in England and Italy. While partisans from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands aided flyers primarily from the 8th Air Force flying out of Great Britain, partisans in the Balkans and Yugoslavia assisted downed airmen mainly from the 15th Air Force flying out of 21 air bases in far southern Italy. During the winter and early spring of 1941, Greek ground forces had worked their way into Albania, igniting an Italian counteroffensive in March intended to clear Greek fighters from the Balkans. Hitler's planned spring invasion of Russia, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, became seriously jeopardized when the Italians failed to dislodge the Greeks. Fearing British air attacks from forward bases in the Greek Isles, Axis war planners attempted to eliminate Balkan resistance through intimidation and one-sided pressure diplomacy. While Hungary and Romania had already joined the Tripartite Pact, Germany focused its efforts on Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. Under duress, Bulgaria agreed to the pact on March 1st of 1941, while Yugoslavia followed suit 3 weeks later. Yugoslavian resistance escalated in response, prompting a coup d'etat in Serbia on March 27th, when breakaway Serbian military officers ousted the sitting government in Belgrade. In its place, they installed 17-year-old King Peter II as the country's puppet titular head. Hitler's angry reprisal came swiftly when he ordered aggressive offensives against both Greek and Yugoslavian forces. "We will burn out for good the festering sore in the Balkans," Hitler boasted to his high command. Operation Punishment began on April 6 of 1941, when German bombers decimated the city of Belgrade with unrelenting force. Aided by panzer divisions, German ground troops stormed Yugoslavia from positions in Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, leading young King Peter II to flee the advancing Wehrmacht. Once Bulgarian resistance had been crushed, German forces swept into Greece. Despite a 75,000-man British expeditionary force intended to strengthen Greek resistance, Greece was forced to surrender on April 21st of 1941. By the end of the month, the British had withdrawn from Greece, taking Greece's king with them as they fled the island nation. Meanwhile, within 2 weeks after the kickoff of Operation Punishment, the largely unprepared Yugoslav military was forced to surrender to overwhelming German aggression. Once victory was at hand, the Reich initiated a vast restructuring of the Balkan states in an effort to quell further belligerency. Serbia gave up parts of its territory to Hungary, Albania, and Bulgaria, while Croatia was formed under the Nazi puppet regime of dictator Ante Pavelić. General Milan Nedić filled the puppet role as the Serbian prime minister, while Italy gained western Slovenia and Montenegro, effectively stripping Yugoslavia of its once dominant authority in the Balkans. With German occupation complete, dissident factions within the region began a steady campaign of resistance against Axis occupation. Plagued by ethnic unrest long before the outbreak of war, Yugoslavia erupted in multifactional violence against German authority. In Serbia, an officer in the general staff led the Chetniks' resistance, which had previously warded off Turkish invaders in the 19th century. As the war progressed, Draza Mihailovic and his Chetnik guerrilla fighters became a popular morale boost for war-anxious Americans, rising to such popularity in the States as to grace the cover of Time magazine in May of 1942. In June of 1941, after the Nazis invaded Russia, Yugoslavia's Communist Party threw their support into the resistance fight against Axis occupation. Led by Josip Broz, known simply as Tito, the Chetniks and the Partisans worked in collaboration against the Germans at first. However, by the end of the year, the two factions were mired in a bloody civil war that outlasted the fall of the Third Reich. While Mihailovich and the Chetniks envisioned a titular monarchy reigning over a centralized Yugoslavia, Tito advocated for a federalized Marxist-Leninist state based on rigid lines of ethnic division. Because of the perceived threats of communist rule in Yugoslavia, Chetnik leadership ultimately cooperated with their Axis occupiers in an effort to weaken Tito's resistance. Labeling all Balkan resistance fighters as communists, Hitler ordered upwards of 100 innocent Yugoslavian hostages executed for every Wehrmacht soldier or flyer killed by either group. In October of 1941, the strategy peaked when 2,300 boys and men were slaughtered at Kragujevac, Serbia, while fierce German anti-partisan offensives came close to wiping out all resistance fighters operating in Yugoslavia at the time. Britain encouraged resistance fighters throughout Europe, yet during the early years of the war, clandestine supply drops were limited and wholly insufficient. For instance, Britain's Special Operations Executive, or SOE, had only 4 liberators dedicated to the resupply of ground units in both Yugoslavia and Greece, which left enormous gaps in the ability for resistance fighters to wage war. Between March of 1942 and February of 1943, the SOE's meager fleet flew 25 supply sorties, primarily to resistance fighters in Greece. The addition of 14 Halifax bombers in early 1943 eventually allowed the SOE to support Yugoslavian resistance fighters, dropping 23 tons of supplies to Chetnik fighters by mid-1943. Frustrated by infighting between the Chetniks and Tito's partisans, by May of 1943, Churchill inserted a delegation into Yugoslavia to ascertain the effectiveness of Tito's partisans. Arriving amidst a blazing German offensive, mission leader William Deacon fought side by side as the partisans struggled to survive the German onslaught of Operation Schwarz, leaving Deacon with an abiding respect for partisan courage under fire. German communication intercepts known as Ultras made it clear that Tito's partisans were conducting the lion's share of sabotage efforts in the Yugoslav theater. Intercepting Enigma messages between German commands, the British soon learned that 5,697 partisan fighters had been killed during Operation Schwarz, compared to 15 casualties for the Chetniks. Accordingly, airdrops to the partisans began in earnest after June 25th of 1943. 2 weeks after the Italians surrendered to the Allies, Sir Fitzroy MacLean parachuted into western Bosnia, home to Tito's makeshift headquarters. Churchill wanted a man of daring character to motivate and guide the partisans, and MacLean never failed on Churchill's desired qualifications. During his tenure in the Balkans, between October and December of 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the Americans' counterpart to the British SOE, managed to ship over 6,000 tons of supplies across the Adriatic to the island of Vis off the Dalmatian coast of Yugoslavia in present-day Croatia. On the return run for Bari, empty cargo ships were loaded with thousands of sick or wounded partisans, bound for medical care at 15th Air Force hospitals and beyond. MacLean's short-lived flotilla ended when the Germans recaptured the Adriatic coast, but by point of comparison, during the previous 3-month period, a meager 125 tons of supplies had been airdropped to the partisans and Chetniks. After the installation of the 15th Air Force in Italy, Lieutenant General Ira Aker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, vowed that the Americans should get some credit in delivering knives, guns, and explosives to the Balkan patriots with which to kill Germans. In response to Acre's wishes, 2 troop carrier squadrons from the 12th Air Force were dedicated to the mission of supplying resistance fighters throughout the Balkans. Based out of Brindisi on the southeastern coast of Italy, 24 aircraft were dedicated to the resupply efforts in support of Balkan resistance fighters. By March of 1944, C-47 Skytrain crews flew nightly missions over Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece, dropping supplies, leaflets, and OSS agents, nicknamed Joes, into the interior of each occupied nation. During a 6-week period from mid-February through the end of March 1944, the 334th Wing flew 82 sorties over the Balkans, delivering over 374,000 tons of armaments, medical supplies, and explosives. "We delivered the goods," wrote 7th Squadron historian, "at the right place, on time, to the right people, well behind Nazi lines of defense." In a display of applied determination typical of the Allied war effort, as Balkan resupply drops intensified during Allied summer offensives against Axis forces, the RAF and the 15th stepped up operations in support of Balkan resistance. On June the 4th of 1944, General Sir Henry M. Wilson, Supreme Allied Commander of the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, tapped Air Vice Marshal William Elliott to head the newly forming Balkan Air Force, or BAF. By the end of 1944, the BAF grew to a force of 21 fighter squadrons, 8 medium bomber squadrons, and 2 heavy bomber squadrons. From the close of 1944 to the end of hostilities in Europe, Balkan resistance fighters now had the supplies they needed to fight a successful guerrilla war against Nazi-occupying forces. Lacking any formal association with organized resistance fighters, ordinary citizens exposed themselves to grave risks in an effort to help downed Allied flyers evade capture through networks of similarly engaged citizen resistance groups. Throughout the war, the Germans' penalty for aiding enemy combatants was death by firing squad for men, while women were typically sent to concentration camps for a slower form of death by exposure, starvation, and overwork. One British intelligence agent estimated that for every downed flyer who was successfully evacuated, 1 resistance member was executed or tortured to death for aiding foreign fighters. While Allied servicemen were trained in the art of evasion and escape, their successful return to Allied air bases proved an enormous morale boost for Allied air crews. In the ETO, including Italy, 3,631 British and Commonwealth servicemen managed to escape across enemy lines. For the Americans, an additional 3,415 servicemen successfully evaded capture, bringing the war total to 7,046. Airmen who successfully evaded capture were typically not allowed to fly additional missions, since their knowledge about escape networks had the potential for compromise should they fall into enemy hands after a second unlucky shootdown behind enemy lines. Returned flyers, however, became important sources of information once they were reunited with their air bases, providing vital information about escape routes and survival techniques to their fellow airmen. The men eat up the stories of the escaped flyers, one Air Force chaplain wrote in his diary. They cling to the accounts like men to a life raft.